Hello guys, welcome to a new edition of React Today as part of the World's Whale Project initiative. Today we're gonna talk about the heat of the moment. Everybody's talking about it, so we won't be the exception to this rule. The document is very important because it exposes Americans and Europeans, but especially Americans, on how they have nowhere to go. They have been lied way too long since the Second World War and before, but this is just unacceptable. I mean, the United States has demonstrated once again why it's a terrorist country, and it doesn't hold a moral ground whatsoever to tell Russia, to tell us, to tell the country or the world why they are the moral ground, and has given them the divine right to orchestrate any movement to any country against all kinds of human rights, in the name of human rights, in the name of democracy, in the name of American interests. And the American interests are nothing but the destruction of the rest of the world that is not aligned with their purposes or interests. So today we're going to go to the document on how America took out the Nord Stream pipeline. Welcome. How America took out the Nord Stream pipeline. The New York Times called it a mystery, but the United States executed a covert sea operation that was kept secret until now. By Seymour Hersh, February 8, 2023. The United States Navy Diving and Salvage Center can be found in a location as obscure as its name, down what was once a country lane in rural Panama City, a now booming resort city in the southwestern panhandle of Florida, 70 miles south of the Alabama border. The center's complex is nondescript as its location, a drab concrete post-World War II structure that has the look of a vocational high school on the west side of Chicago. A coin-operated laundromat and a dance school are across what is now a 4-lane road. The center has been training highly skilled deep-water divers for decades who, once assigned to American military units worldwide, are capable of technical diving to do the good, using C4 explosives to clear harbors and beaches of debris and unexploded ordnance, as well as the bad, like blowing up foreign oil rigs, fouling intake valves for undersea power plants, destroying locks on crucial shipping canals. The Panama City Center, which boasts the second largest indoor pool in America, was the perfect place to recruit the best and most taciturn graduates of the diving school who successfully did last summer what they had been authorized to do, 260 feet under the surface of the Baltic Sea. Last June, the Navy divers operating under the cover of a widely publicized midsummer NATO exercise known as Baltops 22 planted the remotely triggered explosives that 3 months later destroyed 3 of the 4 Nord Stream pipelines, according to a source with direct knowledge of the operational planning. 2 of the pipelines, which were known collectively as Nord Stream 1, have been providing Germany and much of Western Europe with cheap Russian natural gas for more than a decade. A second pair of pipelines, called Nord Stream 2, have been built but were not yet operational. Now, with Russian troops macing on the Ukrainian border and the bloodiest war in Europe since 1945 looming, President Joseph Biden saw the pipelines as a vehicle for Vladimir Putin to weaponize natural gas for his political and territorial ambitions. Asked for comment, Adrienne Watson, a White House spokesperson, said in email, and I quote, "This is false and complete fiction," unquote. Tommy Thorpe, a spokesperson for the Central Intelligence Agency, similarly wrote, and I quote, "This claim is completely and utterly false," unquote. Biden's decision to sabotage the pipelines came after more than 9 months of highly secret back and forth debate inside Washington's national security community about how to best achieve that goal. For much of that time, the issue was not whether to do the mission, but how to get it done with no overt clue as to who was responsible. There was a vital bureaucratic reason for relying on the graduates of the center's hardcore diving school in Panama City. The divers were not Navy only. and not members of American Special Operations Command, whose covert operations must be reported to the Congress and briefed in advance to the Senate and House leadership, the so-called Gang of Eight. The Biden administration was doing everything possible to avoid leaks as the planning took place late in 2021 and into the first months of 2022. President Biden and his foreign policy team, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, and Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary of State for Policy, have been vocal and consistent in their hostility to the two pipelines, which run side by side from 750 miles under the Baltic Sea from two different ports in northeastern Russia near the Estonian border, passing close to the Danish island of Bornholm before ending in northern Germany. The direct route, which bypassed any need to transit Ukraine, had been a boon for the German economy, which enjoyed an abundance of cheap Russian natural gas, enough to run its factories and heat its homes while enabling German distributors to sell excess gas at a profit throughout Western Europe. Action that could be traced to the administrations will violate United States promises to minimize direct conflict with Russia. Secrecy was essential. From its earliest days, Nord Stream 1 was seen by Washington and its anti-Russian NATO partners as a threat to Western dominance. The holding company behind it, Nord Stream AG, was incorporated in Switzerland in 2005 in partnership with Gazprom, a publicly traded Russian company producing enormous profits for shareholders, which is dominated by oligarchs known to be in the thrall of Putin. Gazprom controlled 51% of the company with 4 European energy firms, 1 in France, 1 in the Netherlands, and 2 in Germany, sharing the remaining 49% of stock and having the right to control downstream sales of the inexpensive natural gas to local distributors in Germany and Western Europe. Gazprom profits were shared with the Russian government, and state gas and oil revenues were estimated in some years to amount as much as 45% of Russia's annual budget. America's political fears were real. Putin will now have an additional and much needed major source of income, and Germany and the rest of Europe, of Western Europe, will become addicted to low-cost natural gas supplied by Russia while diminishing European reliance on America. In fact, that is exactly what happened. Many Germans saw Nord Stream 1 as a part of the deliverance of former Chancellor Willy Brandt's famed Ostpolitik theory, which would enable post-war Germany to rehabilitate itself and other European nations destroyed in the World War II by, among other initiatives, utilizing cheap Russian gas to fuel a prosperous Western European market and trading economy. Nord Stream 1 was dangerous enough in the view of NATO and Washington, but Nord Stream 2, whose construction was completed in September of 2021, would, if approved by German regulators, double the amount of cheap gas that would be available to Germany and Western Europe. The second pipeline also will provide enough gas for more than 50% of Germany's annual consumption. Tensions were constantly escalating between Russia and NATO, backed by the aggressive foreign policy of the Biden administration. Opposition to Nord Stream 2 flared on the eve of the Biden inauguration in January 2021, when Senate Republicans, led by Ted Cruz of Texas, repeatedly raised the political threat of cheap Russian natural gas during the confirmation hearing of Blinken as Secretary of State.
Oh, they know because they watched you last week present this information. I hope you did, and if you didn't, seek it out. Okay. It was based on a report, a industry report from over 75 news producers saying that they don't think objectivity is relevant any longer and that old white men are irrelevant in the news business. So I do feel like this was very much a prep for us to see any kind of good journalism from an older white man, and we can throw that away.
So this morning, Seymour Hersh published a new piece of investigative journalism on his own Substack. Like, he's not working at the New Yorker anymore. He's left the New York Times. He's doing this on his own. And it's called America, How America Took took out the Nord Stream pipeline. And in this report, he details down to the exact specifics of how this attack was carried out. This was a major act of international terrorism by the United States.
By then, a unified Senate has successfully passed a law that, as Cruz told Blinken, and I quote, halted the pipeline in its tracks, unquote. There will be enormous political and economic pressure from the German government, then headed by Angela Merkel, to get the second pipeline online. Will Biden stand up to the Germans? Blinken said yes, but added that he had not discussed the specifics of the incoming president's views, and I quote, I know his strong conviction that this is a bad idea, the Nord Stream 2, unquote. He said, and I quote, I know that he will have us use every persuasive tool that we have to convince our friends and partners, including Germany, not to move forward with it, unquote. A few months later, as the construction of the second pipeline neared completion, Biden blinked that May. In a stunning turnaround, the administration waived sanctions against Nord Stream AG, with a State Department official conceding that trying to stop the pipeline through sanctions and diplomacy had, I quote, always been a long shot, unquote. Behind the scenes, administration officials reportedly urged Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, by then facing a threat of Russian invasion, not to criticize the move. There were immediate consequences. Senate Republicans, led by Cruz, announced an immediate blockage of all of Biden's foreign policy nominees and delayed passage of the annual defense bill for months, deep into the fall. Politico later depicted Biden's turnabout on the second Russian pipeline as, I quote, the one decision arguably more than the chaotic military withdrawal from Afghanistan that has imperiled Biden's agenda, unquote. The administration was floundering despite getting on the crisis in mid-November when Germany's energy regulator suspended approval of the second Nord Stream pipeline. Natural gas prices surged 8% within days. Amid growing fears in Germany and Europe that the pipeline suspension and the growing possibility of a war between Russia and Ukraine will lead to a very much unwanted cold winter. It was not clear to Washington just where Olaf Scholz, Germany's newly appointed chancellor, stood. Months earlier, after the fall of Afghanistan, Scholz had publicly endorsed French President Emmanuel Macron's call for a more autonomous European foreign policy in a speech in Prague, clearly suggesting less reliance on Washington's and its mercurial actions. Throughout all of this, Russian troops had been steadily and ominously building up on the borders of Ukraine, and by the end of December, more than 100,000 soldiers were in position to strike from Belarus and Crimea. Alarm was growing in Washington, including an assessment from Blinken that those troop numbers could be doubled in short order, quote unquote. The administration's attention once again was focused on Nord Stream. As long as Europe remained dependent on the pipelines for cheap natural gas, Washington was afraid that countries like Germany would be reluctant to supply Ukraine with the money and weapons it needed to defeat Russia. It was at this unsettled moment that Biden authorized Jake Sullivan to bring together an interagency group to come up with a plan. All options were to be on the table, but only one would emerge: the planning. In December of 2021, 2 months before the first Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, Jake Sullivan convened a meeting of a newly formed task force men and women from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA, and the State and Treasury Departments, and asked for recommendations about how to respond to Putin's impending invasion. It will be the first of a series of top-secret meetings in a secure room on a top floor of the old Executive Office building adjacent to the White House. That was also the home of the President of Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, FIAB. There was the usual back and forth chatter that eventually led to a crucial preliminary question. Will the recommendation forwarded by the group to the President be reversible, such as another layer of sanctions and currency restrictions, or irreversible, that is, kinetic actions which could not be undone? What became clear to participants, according to the source with direct knowledge of the process, is that Sullivan intended for the group to come up with a plan for the destruction of the two Nord Stream pipelines, and that he was delivering on the desires of the president. These are the key players on those secret meetings. Those are Victoria Nuland, Antony Blinken, and Jake Sullivan. Over the next several meetings, the participants debated options for an attack. The Navy proposed using a newly commissioned submarine to assault the pipeline directly. The Air Force discussed dropping bombs with delayed fuses that could be set off remotely. The CIA argued that whatever was done, it would have to be covered. Everyone involved understood the stakes. And I quote, "This is not kiddie stuff," unquote. The source said, "If the attack were traceable to the United States, I quote, is an act of war." Which in fact it was. Back to the document. At the time, the CIA was directed by William Burns, a mild-mannered former ambassador to Russia who had served as Deputy Secretary of the State in Obama administration. Burns quickly authorized an agency working group whose ad hoc members included, by chance, someone who was familiar with the capabilities of the Navy's deep-sea divers in Panama City. Over the next few weeks, members of the CIA's working group began to craft a plan for a covert operation that would use deep-sea divers to trigger an explosion along the pipeline. Something like this had been done before. In 1971, the American intelligence community learned from still undisclosed sources that two important units of the Russian Navy were communicating via an undersea cable buried in the Sea of Okhotsk on Russia's far east coast. The cable linked a regional Navy command to the mainland headquarters at Vladivostok. A hand-picked team of Central Intelligence Agency and National Security Agency operatives was assembled somewhere in the Washington area, under deep cover, and worked out a plan using Navy divers, modified submarines, and deep-state vehicle rescues that succeeded after much trial and error in locating the Russian cable. The divers planted a sophisticated listening device on the cable that successfully intercepted the Russian traffic and recorded it on a taping system. The NSA learned that senior Russian Navy officers, convinced of the security of their communication link, chatted away with their peers without encryption. The recording device and its tape had to be replaced monthly, and the project rolled on merrily for a decade until it was compromised by a 44-year-old civilian NSA technician named Roland Pelton, who was fluent in Russian. Pelton was betrayed by a Russian defector in 1985 and sentenced to prison. He was paid just $5,000 by the Russians for his revelations about the operation, along with $35,000 for other Russian operational data he provided that was never made public. That underwater success, condemned by Bibels, was innovative and risky, and produced invaluable intelligence about the Russian Navy intentions and planning. Still, the interagency group was initially skeptical of the CIA's enthusiasm for a covert deep-sea attack. There were too many unanswered questions. The waters of the Baltic Sea were heavily patrolled by the Russian Navy, and there were no oil rigs that could be used as a cover for a diving operation. Will the divers have to go to Estonia, right across the border from Russia's natural gas loading docks, to train for the mission? It will be a goat fuck, quote unquote, the agency was told. Throughout, I quote, all of this scheming, unquote, the source said, and I quote, some working guys in the CIA and the State Department were saying, don't do this, it's stupid and will be a political nightmare if it comes out, unquote. Nevertheless, in early 2022, the CIA working group reported back to Sullivan's interagency group, and I quote, we have a way to blow up the pipelines, unquote. What came next was stunning. On February 7, less than 3 weeks before the seemingly inevitable Russian invasion of Ukraine, Biden met with his White House office with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who after some wobbling was now firmly on the American team. At the press briefing that followed, Biden defiantly said, and I quote, if Russia invades, there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it. We will bring an end to it, unquote. 20 days earlier, Undersecretary Nuland had delivered essentially the same message at a State Department briefing with little press coverage, and I quote, "I want to be very clear to you today," unquote, she said in response to a question, and I quote, "If Russia invades Ukraine, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward," unquote. You can see the video where Biden testifies to the same. Several of those involved in planning the pipeline mission were dismayed by what they viewed as indirect references to the attack. I quote, "It was like putting an atomic bomb on the ground in Tokyo and telling the Japanese that we are going to detonate it," unquote, the source said. And I quote, "The plan was for the options to be executed post-invasion and not advertised publicly. Biden simply didn't get it or ignored it," unquote. Biden and Nuland's indiscretion, if that is what it was, might have frustrated some of the planners, but it also created an opportunity. According to the source, some of the senior officials of the CIA determined that blowing up the pipeline, and I quote, "no longer could be considered a covert operation because the president just announced that we knew how to do it," unquote. The plan to blow up Nord Stream 1 and 2 was suddenly downgraded from a covert operation requiring that Congress be informed to one that was deemed as a highly classified intelligence operation with United States military support. Under the law, the source explained, and I quote, "there was no longer a legal requirement to report the operation to Congress. All they had to do now is just do it, but it still had to be secret. The Russians have superlative surveillance of the Baltic Sea," unquote. The agency working group members had no direct contact with the White House and were eager to find out if the president meant what he'd said. That is, if the mission was now a go. The source recalled, and I quote, "Bill Burns comes back and says, 'Do it,'" unquote. The operation. Norway was the perfect place to base the mission. In the past few years of East-West crisis, the United States military has vastly expanded its presence inside Norway, whose western border runs 1,400 miles along the North Atlantic Ocean and merges above the Arctic Circle with Russia. The Pentagon has created high-paying jobs and contracts amid some local controversy by investing hundreds of millions of dollars to upgrade and expand American Navy and Air Force facilities in Norway. The new works included, most importantly, an advanced synthetic aperture radar far up north that was capable of penetrating deep into Russia and came online just as the American intelligence community lost access to the series of long-range listening sites inside China. A newly refurbished American submarine base, which had been under construction for years, had become operational, and more American submarines were now able to work closely with their Norwegian colleagues to monitor and spy on a major Russian nuclear redoubt 250 miles to the east on the Kola Peninsula. America also has vastly expanded a Norwegian air base in the north and delivered to the Norwegian Air Force a fleet of Boeing-built P-8 Poseidon patrol planes to bolster its long-range spying on all things Russia. In return, the Norwegian government angered liberals and some moderates in its parliament last November by passing the Supplementary Defense Cooperation Agreement (SDCA). Under the new deal, legal system would have jurisdiction in certain agreed areas, quote unquote. In the north, over American soldiers accused of crimes off base, as well as over those Norwegian citizens accused of or suspected of interfering with the work at the base. Norway was one of the original signatories of the NATO Treaty in 1949, in the early days of the Cold War. Today, the Supreme Commander of NATO is Jens Stoltenberg, a committed anti-communist who served as Norway's Prime Minister for 8 years before moving to his high NATO post with American backing in 2014. He was hardliner on all things Putin and Russia, who had cooperated with the American intelligence community since the Vietnam War. He has been trusted completely since, and I quote, "He is the glove that fits the American hand," unquote, the source said. Back in Washington, planners knew they had to go to Norway. I quote, "They hated the Russians and the Norwegian Navy was full of superb sailors and divers who had generations of experience in highly profitable deep-sea oil and gas exploration," unquote, the source said. They also could be trusted to keep the mission secret. The Norwegians may have had other interests as well. The destruction of the Nord Stream, if the Americas could pull it off, would allow Norway to sell vastly more of its own natural gas to Europe, which is now doing. Back to Europe. Back to the document. Sometime in March, a few members of the team flew to Norway to meet with the Norwegian Secret Service and Navy. One of the key questions was where exactly in the Baltic Sea was the best place to plant the explosives. Nord Stream 1 and 2, each with 2 sets of pipelines, were spread much of the way by little more than a mile as they made their run to the port of Greifswald in the far northeast of Germany. You can see here the black lane is the first Nord Stream 1, the first pipeline built in 2011. And in red you can see Nord Stream 2, it was finished in 2021. You can see here the amplification of the strategic position where it's believed the Norwegians, the Germans and the Americans planned the explosion. The Norwegian Navy was quick to find the right spot in the shallow waters of the Baltic Sea a few miles off Denmark's Bornholm Island. The pipelines ran more than a mile apart along a seafloor that was only 260 feet deep. That would be well within the range of the divers who, operating from a Norwegian Alta-class mine hunter, will dive with a mixture of oxygen, nitrogen and helium streaming from their tanks and plant-shaped C4 charges on the 4 pipelines with concrete protective covers. It would be tedious, time-consuming and dangerous work, but the waters off Bornholm had another advantage. There were no major tidal currents, which would have made the task of diving much more difficult. After a bit of research, the Americans were all in. At this point, the Navy's obscure deep diving group in Panama City once again came into play. The deep sea schools at Panama City, whose trainees participated in Navy bells, are seen as an unwanted backwater by the elite graduates of the Naval Academy at Annapolis, who typically seek the glory of being assigned as a SEAL fighter pilot or submariner. If one must become a black shoe, quote-unquote black shoe, that is, a member of the less desirable surface ship command, there is always a least duty on destroyer cruise or amphibious ship. The least glamorous of all is mine warfare. Its divers never appear in Hollywood movies or on the cover of popular magazines. I quote, "The best divers with deep diving qualifications are a tight community, and only the very best are recruited for the operation and told to be prepared to be summoned to the CIA in Washington," unquote, the source said. The Norwegians and the Americans had the location and the operatives, but there was another concern. Any unusual underwater activity in the waters of Bornholm might draw the attention of the Swedish or Danish navies, which could report it. Denmark, also being one of the original NATO signatories, and was known in the intelligence community for its special ties to the United Kingdom. Sweden had applied for membership into NATO and had demonstrated its great skill in managing its underwater sound and magnetic sensor systems that successfully tracked Russian submarines that would occasionally show up in remote waters of the Swedish archipelago and be forced to the surface. The Norwegians joined the Americans in the insight and insisting that some senior officials in Denmark and Sweden had to be briefed in general terms about possibly diving activity in the area. In that way, someone higher up could intervene and keep a report out of the chain of command, thus insulating the pipeline operation. And I quote, "What they were told and what they knew were purposely different," unquote, the source told me. The Norwegian embassy, asked to comment on this story, did not respond. The Norwegians were key to solving other hurdles. The Russian Navy was known to possess surveillance technology capable of spotting and triggering underwater mines. The American explosive devices needed to be camouflaged in a way that would make them appear to the Russian system as part of the natural background, something that required adapting to the specific salinity of the water. The Norwegian had a fix. The Norwegians also had a solution to the crucial question of when the operation should take place. Every June, for the past 21 years, the American Sixth Fleet, whose flagship is based in Gaeta, Italy, south of Rome, has sponsored a major NATO exercise in the Baltic Sea involving scores of Allied ships throughout the region. The current exercise, held in June, would be known as Baltic Operations 22 or Baltops 22. The Norwegians proposed this would be the ideal cover to plant the mines. The Americans provided one vital element. They convinced the Sixth Fleet planners to add a research and development exercise to the program. The exercise, as made public by the Navy, involved the Sixth Fleet in collaboration with the Navy's research and warfare centers, unquote. The at-sea event will be held off the coast of Bornholm Island and involve NATO teams of diverse planting mines with competing teams using the latest underwater technology to find and destroy them. It was both a useful exercise and ingenious cover. The Panama City boys will do their thing and the C4 explosives will be in place by the end of Baltops 22 with a 48-hour timer attached. All of the Americans and Norwegians will be long gone by the first explosion. The days were counting down. I quote, "The clock was ticking, and we were nearing mission accomplished," unquote, the source said. And then Washington had second thoughts. The bombs will still be planted during Baltops, but the White House worried that a 2-day window for their detonation will be too close to the end of the exercise and it would be obvious that America had been involved. Instead, the White House had a new request, and I quote, "Can the guys in the field come up with some way to blow the pipelines later on command?" Some members of the planning team were angered and frustrated by the president's seeming indecision. The Panama City divers had repeatedly practiced planting the C4 on pipelines as they would during Baltops, but now the team in Norway had to come up with a way to give Biden what he wanted, the ability to issue a successful execution order at the time of his choosing. Being tasked with an arbitrary last-minute change was something that the CIA was accustomed to managing, but it also renewed the concerns some shared over the necessity and legality of the entire operation. The president's secret orders also invoked the CIA's dilemma in the Vietnam War days, when President Johnson, confronted by growing anti-Vietnam War sentiments, ordered the agency to violate its charter, which specifically barred it from operating inside America by spying on anti-war leaders to determine whether they were being controlled by communist Russia. The agency ultimately acquiesced, and throughout the 1970s it became clear just how far it had been willing to go. There were subsequent newspaper revelations in the aftermath of the Watergate scandals about the agency's spying on American citizens, its involvement in the assassination of foreign leaders, and its undermining of the socialist government of Salvador Allende. Those revelations led to a dramatic series of hearings in the mid-1970s in the Senate, led by Frank Church of Idaho, that made it clear that Richard Helms, the agency director at the time, accepted that he had an obligation to what the president wanted, even if it meant violating the law. Repeat it again in this circumstance. Back to the document. In unpublished closed-door testimony, Helms drearfully explained that, I quote, "You almost have an immaculate conception when you do something," unquote, under secret orders from a president. And I quote, "Whether it's right that you should have it or wrong that you shall have it. The CIA works under different rules and ground rules than any other part of the government," unquote. He was essentially telling the senators that he, as head of the CIA, understood that he had been working for the crown and not the Constitution. The Americans at work in Norway operated under the same dynamic and dutifully began working on the new problem, how to remotely detonate the C4 explosives from Biden's order. It was a much more demanding assignment than those in Washington understood. There was no way for the team in Norway to know when the president might push the button. Would it be in a few weeks, in many months, or in a half a year or longer? The C4 attached to the pipelines will be triggered by a sonar buoy dropped by a plane on short notice, but the procedure involved the most advanced signal processing technology. Once in place, the delayed timing devices attached to any of the 4 pipelines could be accidentally triggered by the complex mix of ocean background noises throughout the heavily trafficked Baltic Sea. from near and distant ships, underwater drilling, seismic events, waves, and even sea creatures. To avoid this, the sonar buoy, once in place, would emit a sequence of unique low-frequency tonal sounds, much like those emitted by a flute or a piano, that would be recognized by the timing device and, after a preset hours of delay, trigger the explosives. And I quote, "You want a signal that is robust enough so that no other signal could accidentally send a pulse that detonated the explosive," unquote. I was told by Dr. Theodore Postel, Professor Emeritus of Science, Technology, and National Security Policy at MIT. Postel, who has served as the science advisor to the Pentagon Chief of Naval Operations, said the issue facing the group in Norway because of Biden's delay was one of a chance. And I quote, "The longer the explosives are in the water, the greater risk there will be of a random signal that would launch the bombs off," unquote. On September 26, 2022, a Norwegian Navy P-8 surveillance plane made a seemingly routine flight and dropped a sonar buoy. The signal spread underwater, initially to Nord Stream 2 and then onto Nord Stream 1. A few hours later, the high-powered C4 explosives were triggered and 3 of the 4 pipelines were put out of commission. Within a few minutes, pools of methane gas that remained in the shuttered pipelines could be seen spreading on the water surface, and the world learned that something irreversible had taken place. The fallout. In the immediate aftermath of the pipeline bombing, the American media treated it like an unresolved mystery. Russia was repeatedly cited as a likely culprit, spurred on by calculated leaks from the White House, but without ever establishing a clear motive for such an act of self-sabotage beyond simple retribution. A few months later, when it emerged that Russian authorities had been quietly getting estimates for the costs to repair the pipelines, the New York Times described the news as, and I quote, "complicating theories about who was behind," unquote, the attack. No major American newspapers dug into the earlier threats of the pipelines made by Biden and Undersecretary of State Nuland. While it was never clear why Russia would seek to destroy its own lucrative pipeline, a more telling rationale for the president's action came from Secretary of State Blinken. Asked at a press conference last September about the consequences of the worsening energy crisis in Western Europe, Blinken described the moment as a potentially good one, and I quote, "It's a tremendous opportunity to once and for all remove the dependence on Russian energy and thus to take away from Vladimir Putin the weaponization of energy as a means of advancing his imperial designs. That's very significant, and that offers tremendous strategic opportunity for the years to come. But meanwhile, we are determined to do everything we possibly can to make sure the consequences of all of these are not borne by citizens in our countries or, for that matter, around the world," unquote. More recently, Victoria Nuland expressed satisfaction at the demise of the newest of the pipelines, Nord Stream 2.
How America blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. The greatest investigative journalist in the world is a man by the name of Seymour Hersh. You might know his work. You might not know his name, though. There is Sy Hersh, known as Sy for short, the great journalist Seymour Hersh over the years. He is 85 years old right now. If only we could live to that age and have that level of that body of
mental
work.
acuity.
Yeah. So here's a guy. The only reason we know of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam is because of Seymour Hersh. The only reason we know of the Abu Ghraib prison scandal in Iraq is because of Seymour Hersh. The deep state hates this guy. And right after he's published his reports, of course, the CIA-backed corporate media has come out and tried to take him down. Repeatedly, he's been exonerated every time. This afternoon, after publishing this bombshell story on the Nord Stream pipeline, already his Wikipedia page is being effed with this afternoon. So they love going after these people.
Journalism is not real if it's done by old white men. They know because they watched you last week present this information. I hope you did, and if you didn't, seek it out.
Okay.
It was based on a report, a industry report from over 75 news producers saying that they don't think objectivity is relevant any longer and that old white men are irrelevant in the news business. So I do feel like this was very much a prep for us to see any kind of good journalism from an older white man, and we can throw that away.
So this morning, Seymour Hersh published a new piece of investigative journalism on his own Substack. Like, he's not working at the New Yorker anymore. He's left the New York Times. He's doing this on his own. And it's called America, How America Took Out the Nord Stream Pipeline. And in this report, he details down to the exact specifics of how this attack was carried out. This was a major act of international terrorism by the United States. And if anyone did it to us, we would label it as such, right? If anyone did this to us, it would absolutely be labeled as international terrorism. Am I right? Am I right? Am I right? Of course I'm right. Here's what the Russian embassy at the time said. We note the attempts by some U.S. legislators to put blame on Russia for the incidents that occurred on Nord Stream 1 and 2 gas pipelines. Perhaps they have a better view from the top of Capitol Hill. But if that's the case, they must also have seen the U.S. warships' activities at the very site of the Russian infrastructure disruption just the day before. Or noticed drones and helicopters fly over there, or observed U.S. Navy exercises with underwater explosives that had been conducted in the same area some time ago, meaning that summer. Finally, they should have recalled the promises made by President Biden to bring an end to the Nord Stream 2 project. And if you need a reminder of President Biden calling for the end of the Nord Stream pipeline, here is President Biden talking about how we'll put an end to it no matter what. Watch.
Let me answer the first question first. If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
Yeah.
We just got a super chat asking if Great Britain was involved. They are not mentioned in this report. That's not to say they didn't know or weren't complicit, but he does not mention Great Britain.
As George Eliason has reported also, or has been working on as well, this piece and this idea that Germany was also involved, and there were some green activists, green eco-terrorists involved in Germany that were actively involved in this as well. So Germany is not quiet in all of this, but this Seymour Hersh piece particularly is just on the United States side of this right now. Go ahead, David.
It would seem that Germany would have to be involved in some way, because it's like, if this is true, then they knowingly gave up cheaper energy to screw their people, right? Or they can claim that they didn't know, but now they do. And so what, do they turn around and now take the gas to help the people that they said they couldn't before? Because, it's like they're in a spot now, like they've got some questions to answer.
Right.
With regard to Nord Stream 2, we continue to have very strong and clear conversations with our German allies, and I want to be clear with you today. If Russia invades Ukraine, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward.
Victoria Nuland came out in that Senate testimony in front of Senator Ted Cruz and was like, "I'm just as excited as you are, Senator Ted Cruz, about us carrying out international terrorism." Watch.
Senator Cruz, like you, I am, and I think the administration is very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea.
But we have the report, we just can't share it with anybody. Like, we know who did this, but maybe we can't make this public. We're sorry.
Back to the document. Testifying at a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing in late January, she told Senator Ted Cruz, and I quote, "Like you, I am, and I think the administration is very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea," unquote. The source had a much more streetwise view of Biden's decision to sabotage more than 1,500 miles of Gazprom pipeline as winter approached. And I quote, "Well," he said, speaking of the president, and I quote, "I gotta admit the guy has a pair of balls. He said he was going to do it, and he did," unquote. Asked why he thought the Russians failed to respond, he said cynically, and I quote, "Maybe they want the capability to do the same things the US did." It was a beautiful cover story, he went on. Behind it was a covert operation that placed experts in the field and equipment that operated on a covert signal. The only flaw was the decision to do it, unquote. And here ends the document for us, for the country, and for the world. I hope this is not a thing to enjoy. What they are saying is that they're not only accepting that they did the attempt, the terrorist attack, but they're natively bragging about it. And what is it that the United States of America is holding up like the moral ground for them to sabotage, to destroy, to cause terrorist attacks, to take presidents out of office, regardless of if they have been democratically elected or not? They have been doing this for way too long, and the rest of the world needs to keep quiet and not say a word? Well, no. It happens with Central and South America for decades now, since and before the Second World War, before and after. But for the first time, the United States have been told no when President Biden, or the administration of current President Biden, asked Colombian President Gustavo Petro to give all the Soviet-era tanks and ammunitions and equipment that Colombia and South America has in order to send them to Ukraine so the Ukrainians can fight the Russians. And President Gustavo Petro said no. For more than 200 years we have been submitted to different practices against us. Why would we promote war in other countries? We want peace in our country, we want peace in the world. We are not going to contribute to your request, Mr. Biden administration. The same happened with the Argentinian president in a press conference held in Europe, where he was asked if he was going to contribute with the Soviet-era tanks and battle equipment that he has from the Soviet era, and he said, beside Chancellor Scholz, that he will not do that, which was, of course, a slap in the face of Chancellor Scholz, which, of course, accepted just last week to send Leopards 2, again with more than 39 or 40 Abraham tanks by the United States, and now, of course, Portugal and Finland and Sweden willing to add weaponry, resources, logistics, etc., to go against Russia. So we need to answer a question here, or many questions, and those are: does the United States have served as an example to follow in the war against Russia? Should we go to war against Russia? We Canadians, should we go to war against Russia now that Canadians is helping the invasion in Haiti? Another aspect, another issue that we need to talk about. And now that, for example, German citizens were attacked in Colombia before the new president was elected by the far-right government in that country, wanting to kill a German citizen, but she was protected by a Colombian activist that protected her and got all the bullets. As you can see, what we need to ask, is Canada willing to go to war against Russia? Because that's what it's supporting. And we need to understand that if Canada goes to war against Russia, which is what it's doing now, and also Haiti, well, Canada is going to be targeted, and we're going to bring the war home. Like in the days of the SDS, the American students were saying, hey, we need to stop the war against Vietnam. And that war was also covered by Seymour. And Seymour was the one, he's also a Pulitzer Prize winner, of course. He is responsible for us, the country and the world, on knowing the Abu Ghraib abuses that Americans were doing in the prison. Not only that, but he was responsible also for the massacre of My Lai. I don't know if you remember, we have covered that circumstance years before, 5 or 6 years before, in my program in Spanish and English. the My Lai massacre, with more than 500 women, children, and kids were assassinated by American troops, and how the war degrades into assassinations and killings that cause trauma to the soldiers who later, in the case of Vietnam, came to the United States fucked up in their minds to commit crimes and to destroy their families, and to kids to grow up without a parent, addicted to heroin, etc. And you should know that in the United States there are more than 100 soldiers or veterans linked or in prison. More than 10,000 of them have committed homicide. These statistics you can find out on your own. I'll give the data on the credits. But we need to find out what are we going to do, because in Germany people are protesting the war and the decision making of Olaf Scholz. People are protesting the decision making of the Foreign Relations Council in Germany, who says, like in all the other European, especially Spain and many other European countries, that Ukraine is the priority, no matter that the people is going to take the cold in wintertime. It's just that we were very lucky. In most zones in the world, winter has been diminished by, I don't know, 50%. By now it's +6 here in Canada. It's unacceptable. This is February. We should be -25, -30 by this time of the month, and in January too. But no, we have temperatures on the +4, +5 during this week. But the main point is, should we go to war against Russia? Should we make our country a target of the Russians when the nukes come falling? I don't think so. If I were Prime Minister of Canada, I correct here, I would say no, and I will withdraw from NATO. I will be the first one to say, NATO, I'm done with you guys. You're going to wars, you're not really developing any country, and you're really destroying with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund all possibilities for any country to develop themselves. I will be the first one to accept that. I know that the powers that be are too big and the corporate intelligence is too strong, but somebody has to start stepping up against them. And Lula da Silva, Colombian president and Argentinian president, already begun that, because like I explained in my last programs about the truth in the second chapter, Europeans are beginning to understand what the third world countries suffered under the hand of a morality badge, a moral badge that the Americans are supposed to have, when they have proven over the centuries and over the last 100 years that they don't, and it's total control over their interests, which is to submit the countries to their whim and caprice, and to go to war and destroy any other country or every other country that doesn't submit to their imperialist tactic, way more than Russia has done in Crimea or has done in Ukraine in the 4 states. I'm not for the war in Ukraine. On the contrary, I suffer myself when I pray for them and the citizens of Ukraine. But to say that Ukraine is not being used as a ground, as a bridge to be destroyed and burned in order to advance against Russia, is not only lack of vision, but lack of self-understanding of how things work in this world. And the United States and NATO, when they said we have tools to control Hungary because it's going out of hand, or whatever country is going out of hand, we have tools to control them, demonstrates that the United States has influenced Europe so much that the cowardly European Union has been directed not by the European Union presidents and prime ministers, but the European Council in Brussels, which only dictates policy and lobbyists to dictate the policies in healthcare and everything, the same that happened in Canada and the United States, issues that have been lighting up for the last 6 months, now that the pandemic has demonstrated how a fraud was that of the. So there's many issues that we need to ask ourselves and resolve these issues. But the fact that the United States attacked the Russian pipeline in order to sell 4 times more at the price, the natural price, the cheap gas of Russia, demonstrated the United States' interests are not for us, the country and the world, but to cause the hegemony of the world only by their hands and the surveillance system and their banking systems and everything that is evil and against the people's interests, as is being demonstrated in the protests all around the world, never covered, of course, by the mainstream media.
Senator Cruz, like you, I am, and I think the administration is very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea.
The sledgehammer that we have against Putin is to shut down the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and do it permanently.
This is a real, acute, and proven threat.
I'm a big proponent of making sure we stop Nord Stream 2 from happening.
Stopping the Nord Stream 2.
And we need the chancellor is there right now. Assets like the Nord Stream 2.
And, Trump also isn't wrong to identify Nord Stream 2, this pipeline that he talked about today, as problematic.
There is still time to stop Nord Stream 2 if we act quickly.
The timeline for action is short.
And I'm not going to stop working to halt Nord Stream 2 to stop Russia.
End it once and for all.
I mean, he needs to kill the Nord Stream 2 pipeline right now.
And I think the most important thing right now, and what Zelensky said, is they want Nord Stream 2 stopped. That's what I see as the most tangible reason and the tangible effect.
I believe we must stop this Nord Stream 2 pipeline.
Yeah, and they did.
But we are present in here, and I am calling my God, you should start doing the same, because if these American interests are going to take us to war, and nukes are going to come to Canada and all around the world, there's only one probability, like I mentioned before, for us, the country and the world, to be saved, and that is the UAPs. The UAPs are you normally known as UFOs, which was another lie that the Americans and Europeans always covered. They're going to be the only ones responsible to stop a nuclear hecatomb, because, to tell you the truth, they have demonstrated how in the past they have gone to different silos where nuclear heads are being crowded, and the silos that we're talking about thousands of them, thousands of nuclear bombs. The UAPs are the only ones that have stopped them for functioning. You have to consider that. I'm calling my God. You should do yours. But let me tell you, your God, in the case of the congressmen and women in the United States, is not the same as mine. Please don't confuse that. Because if you are for the war against Russia, you are for the war against yourself. And that means that you don't understand what's really going on. I'm not defending Russia, but Russia, throughout history, has demonstrated way more responsibility than these covert actions that are always secret and not benefiting any country in the world, but the disastrous outcomes that we have seen since Libya, Iraq, Syria, and now with and I finish with this, the earthquake in Syria. The United States is showing off like charity. The United States should leave Syria immediately, like the United States should release the extradition of Julian Assange immediately. We are not as full as you think. And if we don't have army, navy, military, police that are supposed to protect the citizens and not the few, that also shows the cowardice of the generals. 5-star generals, 4-star generals that show their authority of betraying their own people. That's cowardless, that's cowardly, and only God can help us now. For us, for the country, for the world, hope to see you next time, the next edition of React Today, as part of the World's Whale Project Initiative. Au revoir, bye-bye, hasta pronto. It's time for you to go. Justin Trudeau. Release Julian Assange immediately.